Now, when we talk about naval aviation and its beginnings, where did it actually begin? What's the birthplace and the birth date of naval aviation? Where did it start? Well, there are 4 locations and dates are cited in that event. We have Norfolk, Virginia on 14 November 1910. A second one is San Francisco, California on 18 January 1911. Third one, San Diego, California, 17 February 1911. And finally, in Washington, D.C., 8 May 1911. 4 locations, 4 dates. What events happened in these locations? What took place that made them the birthplace of naval aviation, or to be cited as the birthplace and birth date of naval aviation? Let's take a brief look at each one. 14 November 1910 in Norfolk, Virginia. A gentleman by the name of Eugene Ely flew a biplane off of the bow of the USS Birmingham, anchored off the offshore from Hampton Roads down in Norfolk, Virginia, from a platform, a wooden platform that had been built on the bow of the ship. Now, he managed to get airborne. As you can see, he's sort of pointed in the wrong direction, but he did get airborne. And he flew a couple of miles and landed on the beach just about 2 or 3 miles away. This was a significant event. It actually proved that an airplane could be launched from a ship and recovered elsewhere. Brings us to San Francisco, California, a few months later, 18 January 1911. Same pilot, same airplane, Eugene Ely, took off from shore this time and flew out to another Navy ship, this time the USS Pennsylvania. A wooden platform had been built on the stern of that ship, and he successfully landed there. Now, San Francisco is a lot more significant because an hour later, he turned around and took off from the Pennsylvania and returned to shore. So that was a very significant achievement. It was a much cleaner event than what happened in Norfolk. And this was definitely a very important beginning spot for the concept of naval aviation. Just a month later in San Diego, California, 17 February 1911, Mr. Curtis, who was building the airplanes and trying to sell them to the Navy, flew the airplane this time. It was actually a seaplane, a float plane. He took off from shore, from adjacent to the shoreline, flew out, landed next to the Pennsylvania, was hoisted aboard, spent some time. Aircraft was hoisted back. He took off, flew back to shore. This also was important. It's significant. It showed the importance. It showed that airplanes could be launched from and recovered from ships by landing on the water. Not entirely practical, but it demonstrated the concept. Now that brings us these 3 events. These 3 events that have happened had 3 things in common, we'll see. First of all, Norfolk, San Francisco, and San Diego. The events were, each case, the airplane was owned by Glenn Curtis, who was trying to sell these airplanes to the Navy, and he was developing them. They were flown by a civilian pilot helping Mr. Curtis sell airplanes to the Navy, Eugene Ely. And the only thing the Navy really had in the game at that point was the ship. The Navy allowed the ship to be used to demonstrate the concept. Could airplanes be launched from and recovered from ships? Sort of proved that they did. So all 3 of these events led up to that. That finally brings us to Washington, D.C. on 8 May 1911. What happened in Washington? Well, give you a clue. It rhymes with honey. It's money. It's all about the money. Nothing happens in government or anywhere else for that matter, without the money. And in Washington, D.C. on 8 May 1911, Captain Washington Irving Chambers, class of 1876, signed and prepared the requisition purchasing the Navy's first 2 aircraft from Glenn Curtis, sitting at his desk in Washington. This becomes the official birthday of naval aviation because in the Navy, nothing is considered in existence or born until the money has been requisitioned. And that's what happened on 8 May. So we have the official birth date of naval aviation being May 8th, 1911, and the official birthplace of naval aviation being San Diego, California, and then all these other locations coming into play as well. So it makes kind of a complex story. Let's put the pieces together and see what we have for a story. It's like a puzzle. We know what happened, see what happened in Norfolk, Virginia, in November 1910. That's an important piece of the puzzle. The story wouldn't be complete without it. And then just a short while later, San Francisco, California, another piece comes into play, and yet another in San Diego. And finally, in May of 1911, the money piece comes into play. So now we have the outline of the story of the beginning of naval aviation. This is kind of the framework where the whole story comes together. These are the pieces that you typically read about when you look at the conventional written history of naval aviation. But what happened in the middle? What brings this, sort of ties it together, brings this whole story to make it more complete? What happened and where did it happen? Well, it happened right here, the U.S. Naval Academy, between 1911 and 1961. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today and tell you a little more about it. So, naval aviation in Annapolis. For convenience, I've broken it down into 4 periods to talk about. The first is the early period, from 1911 to 1914. Then we have the interwar period between 1919 and 1939. It's a period historians refer to as the interwar period, of course, between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. We then have the war years from World War II between 1939 and 1945. And finally, we have the post-war period from 1945 to 1961. The important takeaway here is to know that the Naval Academy was actively involved in all 4 of these periods of the development of naval aviation. So let's start with the early period, naval aviation in Annapolis from 1911 to 1914, a very brief, very important, very productive period of time in the development of naval aviation. On 27 June 1911, the Secretary of the Navy authorized the establishment of an airfield at Annapolis. And just barely a month later, the construction of the Greenberry Point field and hangar began. And that's what it looked like after it was built. We have a hangar on the eastern side of Greenberry Point. The back behind the hangar there you see is the Chesapeake Bay. Now, let's locate it on a map. We, of course, know there's Greenberry Point. Sorry, jumped ahead. There's Greenberry Point. You see the Bay Bridge over there and the Naval Academy down in the lower left. So let's zoom in a little bit tighter, a little tighter view, and we see, again, Greenberry Point. And then over here to the left, you can see what is now the small craft facility and the marina and everything there. Now, one of the most interesting documents I came across during my research on this was this drawing, a sketch made back in 1911 by the aviation crew that was working, and to show the location of the Greenberry Point hangar. So I was curious to where was the hangar actually located, because I wanted to go to Greenberry Point and actually stand on the spot or close to it and see where, hey, this is where they were. Well, turns out they used a U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey chart. As you can see in the on their drawing, they actually gave the source of it from October of 1911. I was able to locate that chart online, and here's the chart that they actually used to trace the outline of Greenberry Point. So we're going to zoom in a little tighter on the Greenberry Point part to get it closer to what they actually traced. As you can see by comparing the drawings, that's pretty close, accurate representation of what Greenberry Point looked like at the time. Now, obviously, that's changed over the years due to shoreline erosion and such. However, there are a number of clues, visual clues that they give on the drawing as far as like scale and line of sight and everything that allows me to pretty, I believe, with relative accuracy, say, well, the hangar would have been located right about there on Greenberry Point. So what does that mean for today? Let's take a look at it. Again, the Google Earth map of Greenberry Point, and the hangar would have been built probably right about in that location. We know what it looks like from the photographs, and that's where it would have been. So Greenberry Point was, in fact, the first U.S. Naval Air Station. It was built in 1911. Here we have a photograph of Lieutenant John Towers, who's Naval Aviator number 3. You're going to meet him in a few minutes, along with the other 2. And you see him coming, either returning from or heading out on a flight in the Curtiss. Again, that's the bay behind him. And then this is the front of the hangar. You can see it was pretty much a muddy mess. It was basically a swamp that was built into an airfield. There's a lot of work that had to be done to make it flyable. The buildings in the background are what were later became the Naval Academy dairy farm in place. And the aircraft you see just landing there is the Wright B-1 being flown by Lieutenant Rogers, aviator number 2. The B-1, by the way, is a replica of which is in Dahlgren Hall today. We'll see some more photographs of that. Here's Lieutenant Rogers, the tall guy in the middle, after just landing in the B-1 in Greenberry Point. The hangar is to the right in this image, was kind of like from where the cameraman is standing. And then these are the enlisted guys standing with the B-1 in front of the hangar, Greenberry Point. Another shot of the hangar and the B-1. And here's a photo of the Curtiss. There were basically two types of aircraft, the Wright and the Curtiss, two totally different aircraft, different methods of flying, completely separate. Again, this, you can see the background, the way the land shapes, and you can see a little bit of the water. The bay is behind the hangar, as I said. So here's Greenberry Point, and that's general location today. And you look at the photograph of Towers and the Curtiss, and you can kind of see the landmass behind them, the Bay Bridge, of course, to the right. So we're pretty much in the same location. Now, in 1911, we had the Greenberry Point, which is the first highlighted point. By 1912, they decided they needed to get a little closer to the Naval Academy. Another problem was Greenberry Point, they discovered, was downrange from the Midshipman rifle range. And they discovered that, you know, high rounds that would go over the berm at the firing range were landing on the hangar and the airplane. Fortunately, no one was hit. But they decided, well, kind of scaled back the use of Greenberry Point. Still was used. It was also kind of inconvenient to get to. They had to take a motorboat all the way from the Naval Academy all the way out there. It's a pretty long haul in a small boat. Anyway, they secured permission to build build 5 hangar tents on the north shore of the Severn, directly across from Santee Basin, what's known as Beeman's Point. That's also the Rattel recreation area over at the naval station. And they erected these 5 hangar tents. You can see just over the top of the last tent, that's the very top of the building, the original building from the Naval Marine Engineering Lab, which the remains of which is still standing today. Rather sad shape, but it's still standing. So if you look at the picture today, you don't have that same view because a newer building is in the way, but you can see the 2 air vents sticking up are actually from the old building. So shows you where we're looking, pretty much the exact same location along what's now a rocky shoreline is where these tents were located. And that's where they flew out of. So let's meet these aviators. Who are the first naval aviators? Well, the first one was Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, class of 1905. He's actually a classmate of Chester Nimitz. He was naval aviator number 1. Commander Ellison died in a plane crash on 27 February 1928. In fact, it was his birthday. Now, up until recently, there's nothing commemorating Lieutenant Ellison or his achievements or anything else in the Naval Academy. There's no buildings named after him. There's no roads. However, when they decided to erect the static aircraft display up next to the fire station in the observatory, it was going to be called Aviation Park. I submitted a proposal to Admiral Carter at the time, and I was very pleased that he was excited about it, and decided, yeah, it could be called Ellison Park, and that's what it became. We now have a very nice park and dedication plaque to Lieutenant Ellison. Admiral Buck was kind enough to sponsor a very nice dedication ceremony this past October. We had descendants of Lieutenant Ellison's came. It was quite an event. And now we have something commemorating the first naval aviator here at Annapolis, who, by the way, is buried right up the hill in the cemetery, in the Naval Academy Cemetery. Aviator number 2 was Lieutenant John Rogers. Lieutenant Rogers comes from a long line of naval personnel, naval officers dating back to the Revolution. He was class of 1903. A lot of people wonder why he was aviator number 2, because he had seniority to Lieutenant Ellison, who was class of 1905. And The answer to that is because he got his wings second. He was the second person to earn his wings. Ellison was first. And it actually became a point of contention between these two, Ellison believing that he was senior to Rogers in matters concerning aviation. So it became kind of a point of contention. But that's the reason he's aviator number 2. He also died early in his career, not close to the same time that Ellison did, in a plane crash in Delaware Bay. Our third original naval aviator was Lieutenant John Towers, the youngest. He was in the class of 1906, and he was the only one of the 3 to survive to a full career. Now, the significance of these 3 aviators is these were the first 3. By being the first 3, these were the ones that were trained by the manufacturers. Ellison and Towers were trained by Curtiss to fly his airplane, and Lieutenant Rogers was trained by the Wright brothers to fly the B-1. Every naval aviator since could theoretically trace their aviator lineage through their instructors, through their first naval flight instructors, back to one of these 3 guys, because they just started training aviators, and these are the first 3. Towers, as I said, was the only one to survive to a full career, and he had a very distinguished career. He served as the first commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet during the Second World War. He retired as a 4-star general in December of 1947, and he died in April of 1955. That brings us to what happened at Annapolis. What else happened at Annapolis? Okay, we built a hangar, we built an airfield. September 1911 was quite an eventful month in naval aviation history, and in particular for the Naval Academy. On September 6, 1911, the Navy's first airplane was the Wright B-1, and it arrived at Dahlgren Hall in several wooden crates. And then that day, Lieutenant Rogers and the crew unpacked and assembled the aircraft. Now, the next date, September 7th, 1911. If anybody's taking notes, this is a date to write down. It's an extraordinarily important date for the Naval Academy and for naval aviation, because on September 7th, 1911, for the first time in history, an airplane that was owned by the Navy, flown by a naval aviator, took off from naval property. Where did that happen? Well, it happened off the seaward end of Dahlgren Hall, as you can see in this photograph. Lieutenant Rogers took off from Farragut Field. He circled the field a few times and landed. There was a small write-up in the local paper. He took off later that afternoon after fueling the plane, headed west, and actually flew to Washington, D.C., landing on the Washington Mall. Probably wouldn't want to try that today. And it happened from here, took off from the seaward side of Dahlgren Hall, which you can see looks pretty much like it did then, very similar to what it did then. In fact, if you look, looks like almost the same bare spot of grass. Probably not, but that's the location. So the significance of this date and this flight is that this was the first all-Navy flight. Navy pilot, Navy airplane, Navy property. First time it happened. So while you can have a lot of places, four places that talk about the birth of naval aviation, or can claim to be the birthplace of naval aviation, like San Diego, San Francisco, Norfolk, they all had a piece in it. Yeah, they can all say they were in some way, shape, or form the birthplace of naval aviation. However, only one place can say that it's the birthplace and the birth date of U.S. Naval Air Forces, and that's the Naval Academy. And it's also the first home of naval aviation. That's where we were first based. Greenberry Point was the first naval air station, and it was there for a brief time, 1911 to 1914, but that was the first. And we have the plaque there now to tell all our visitors, this is where it happened. Now, what else happened at Annapolis? It wasn't just being the first home of naval aviation. They were actually doing a lot of work there. Number one, they were training pilots. That was one of the first and foremost. A lot of pilots early pilots earned their wings right there from Greenberry Point or from the tents on the north shore of the Severn here at the Academy. One of the major things that happened here was the first attempt to launch an airplane from a catapult And that happened on the Santee Dock on 31 July 1912. Now, I emphasize the word attempt because unfortunately it wasn't successful. Now, the gentleman you see on the top of the aircraft rigging the crane is Lieutenant Ellison. And you might be wondering, why is he dressed up in his white, white uniforms and everybody else is in work clothes? Remember, this is July 1912, Annapolis. It's hot and he's doing manual work. Well, the reason he's dressed like that was shortly before this, he was working again with his crew on the aircraft, and the superintendent of the Naval Academy at the time, Captain Gibbons, was not a big fan of aviation or aviators or this new technology. He was definitely old Navy. And he saw Lieutenant Ellison aboard, in his work clothes, and reprimanded him, and said, Mr. Ellison, when you're aboard the Naval Academy, you will dress accordingly and provide a proper role model for the midshipmen. Well, Lieutenant Ellison, being a good naval officer, said, yes, sir. And he put his whites on. But he's still doing his work. Anyway, he's set up to go. The airplane was ready to launch. It was set up on a catapult that was manufactured. You can see it was using an old abandoned torpedo tube and an air compressor. Pretty sophisticated and pretty much effective, except for one small problem. It didn't work this time, or it didn't work the way it should. By the way, to orient that, if you look out over to the left of the aircraft through the wings, you see you can see the outline of Greenberry Point. Today, the sailing center would be like in this area, so that'll sort of orient you to where we are in today's geography. So the airplane was all primed and ready to go. Ellison got in the seat, got the engine running, and took off. But a problem with the car releasing from the rail and a crosswind at just an inopportune time meant that the airplane and the pilot ended up taking a swim in what was probably a lot cleaner Severn River than it is today. Fortunately, the airplane was not damaged, believe it or not, and also the pilot was not injured. So he got up and did it again. About 3 months after this event, sometime in September, I believe it was, Lieutenant Ellison did manage to successfully launch from a catapult, but it was done in the same airplane, but it was done down at the Washington Navy Yard. So another major event, first that took place in Annapolis, was the first time that we had wireless air-to-ground communication. That happened on 27 September 1912. The gentleman on the left is an Ensign Maddox. He was working on wireless for the Navy. He was a friend of Lieutenant Towers, and they agreed to try to get it to work on the airplanes. The pilot you see standing there is Lieutenant Ellison, and they developed it here, and they later perfected or used it again out in San Diego, but it started here at Annapolis. Also, the first night landings. Sorry, no pictures of that. But this is an experiment they did. They had sailors took boats out, small boats out into the Severn, formed two parallel lines, and they had buckets of oily rags they lit up and provided a outline for the runway on the water, and were able to successfully demonstrate night landings. I don't think it was used that much, but it was just a demonstration. Now, not all these firsts that happened at Annapolis were all good things or positive things. Sadly, the first naval aviation fatality occurred from Annapolis. Ensign William Billingsley on June 20th, 1913, was killed. He and Lieutenant Towers were making a flight, as they did in those days. They would take off from Greenberry Point, and they would fly to different locations, usually around the Eastern Shore. In this case, they had flown around to the St. Michael's area, nonstop, just flying around just to prove that the airplane could navigate and could go from one point A to point B. On the way back, south of Kent Island, they hit some gust or downdraft. The airplane pitched forward. They weren't wearing seat belts at that time. Ensign Billingsley fell 1,200 feet to his death. Lieutenant Towers was able to hang on, and the airplane basically spiraled down and hit the water. He was actually severely injured, but he survived. And that was the first naval aviation fatality. The aircraft was recovered. We see it here. It was one of the Wright airplanes, and there's the wreckage of it. It was brought back to the old experimental station. That building in the background is the original naval engineering lab that's, again, still standing there today. You know, I mentioned they did a lot of flying. They would fly in different locations. Here we have the Wright B-1 that took a flight, made a flight from Annapolis, landed up in the Baltimore Harbor. I believe the USS Louisiana was anchored there as well at the time. That's where they had the launches from the ship came out to help the guys on the aircraft. But that is Baltimore Harbor. It's in the spring of 1912. And then Lieutenant Ellison and Towers flew the Curtiss over to Centerville on the Chester River, or the Corsica River. And in fact, if you go to Centerville today, in this location, there's a park, a public park that's on the pretty much where this view is taken on the opposite shore of the Corsica. And there's a plaque there with the same photograph. It was quite an event for the people of Centerville, and there was a big write-up on it in the paper. This is obviously the first time any of these people had seen an airplane, so it was quite the public event. Well, we come to January 1914, and the Annapolis Aviation Camp packed up their tents, equipment. They moved south, and they established the Pensacola Naval Air Station, which we have is the home of naval aviation today. So for the next decade, there would be no aviation activity at Annapolis, which brings us to the next period, these interwar years between 1919 and 1939, an incredibly important period of time in history, not only for naval aviation, the Naval Academy, but for the world in general. A lot happening in those years, economically, politically, militarily, an enormously significant period in time. And in fact, if it had not been for one event that happened during this period of time, and that's the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, had it not been for this event, it's likely that my presentation would be over now, and it would just be naval aviation in Annapolis, 1911 to 1914. You'll see from the next few slides how this drastically changed that event. The Washington Naval Treaty between the great allies from the recently concluded Great War was signed among them. Interestingly, the First World War, even though it didn't have the famous naval battles that would be featured in the Pacific a couple of decades later, it was nevertheless one of the major catalysts for the Great War was the naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany. That was one of the major catalysts that started, that added the flashpoint for the war. So after the conclusion of the war, the Allies got together and decided this is basically an arms control treaty. We can't have nations just rapidly building up naval forces beyond what they need for protection and whatnot. So they agreed to this treaty. It was very controversial, actually, in the day. But essentially, it restricted the number of battleships and cruisers. But there was a lot of wiggle room with aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers were considered more experimental at the time and not necessarily weapon platforms. So they were cut a little more slack. And the keels, by the time this conference concluded, keels for the cruisers, USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, had already been laid, and they were to be scrapped. Except someone came up with the idea, well, no sense in scrapping good metal, wasting good steel. Let's convert them to aircraft carriers. And in fact, the keels were then built up into the USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, CV2 and 3 respectively. Now, of course, those names become very well known just a couple of decades later in the Pacific War. But what was the impact of the Washington Naval Treaty on naval aviation? Well, it was quite significant. It changed the Navy's focus from seaplanes to land planes. That gives us a requirement for more planes. You're going from seaplanes, a couple of airplanes on a ship here and there, going out to now we're going to take one big ship. We're going to take the airfield, basically, bring all these airplanes out. That's going to give us more planes. Well, more planes equals more pilots to fly them. And more planes plus more pilots means, well, we need more places to fly them from. So this became a real game changer in naval aviation, because now we wanted airfields on or near all naval locations. Well, the first one, you need more pilots. Where do you go to get more pilots? So, Naval Academy sounds like a good place. In 1925, midshipmen began receiving orientation flights directly from the Naval Academy. And here we have a photograph taken around that time, around 1925. You see some Martin PM-1 patrol planes, which was in the previous photograph. They're sitting at anchor out there in the Severn. They would anchor. The midshipmen would come from their classrooms in the Isherwood Hall and the other buildings. This, by the way, is where present-day Alumni Hall is. There's Mahan Hall for reference. Right in this area now is where the Nimitz Library is. You can see we've recovered a lot of land there. And you see the old Severn River Bridge in the background. So there's the aircraft anchored. The mids would be taken out in boats on the plane. They would take 3 or 4 mids at a time in these airplanes, and they would do their orientation flights. A year later, 1926, the Aviation Training Squadron VN-8 was established at the Naval Academy. This is behind where Alumni Hall is now. And in the background here, you see the hill going up into the Naval Academy Cemetery for reference sake. Well, they didn't only fly the airplanes, they also had to learn how to fly them. This is from one of the early aero labs of the day, and that would have been like an Isherwood Hall, where they, midshipmen, this is, by the way, it was, from 1925, where they're learning what makes these airplanes fly. How do they fly, in addition to being able to fly them. So by 1932, orientation flights were fully integrated into the curriculum. Here we see one of the Martin PM-1s flying the aircraft that you see the squadron designation is 8. That was from VN-8, and this aircraft is flying over the Severn. The Naval Academy is off to the left here. So by 1932, that was orientation flights were fully integrated into it, and they continued right up until the outbreak of World War II, where later in this photograph, these are some PNY-2 aircraft. This actually comes from the collection of retired Navy captain in the class of 1943. He was gracious enough to let me have these photographs that he actually took as a midshipman on one of these flights. And right up until the outbreak of World War II, of course, when the orientation flight stopped. Now, what was happening is we had an increased pace in flight operations in Annapolis, and that required suitable facilities, which really didn't exist. Here's a photograph from 1938 of the Naval Academy, and the Naval Aviation, the aircraft wing, was pretty much isolated to this highlighted area. We had the Rihanna Mercedes and this barge, floating barge that served as administrative and shop space. But this was the sum and extent of the aviation facilities for the Naval Academy. Now I'm going to zoom in on this highlighted area, and that's the Santee Pier, which 26 years earlier is where we saw Lieutenant Ellison attempting his first launch from a catapult. But you can see the aircraft are all out in the open. There's a crane set up on one corner. The airplanes would be raised from the water up here, and then they were stored on this pier. Totally outside storage, no inside maintenance or storage. Is very hard on the aircraft. There's another view of how things worked. You can see again the Rihanna Mercedes, and you see these aircraft all out. These appear to be taxiing out because they're going to turn around and come back, take off this way on their flights. But that's how it would operate. We had aircraft from other squadrons would come in. There was Squadron 10 down, Patrol Squadron 10 down in Norfolk that would come up. So you'll see airplanes with Squadron 10. Squadron 8 was the VN-8 that actually had planes assigned full time here. But there was no place to keep them. So no hangar space for storage, for maintenance, and no more land to build them. There's only so much land in the Naval Academy. Well, not really, because what does the Navy do when it needed more land back in those days? Well, you got that big old river out there. So let's see if we can get some more land out of it. Beginning in the late 1930s, they began doing just that, to create more land. And over on the north shore of the Severn, you can see where they said, hey, here's a great place. We can build a hangar, we can build concrete, we can fill in here, we can fill in there. Of course, this is today what is now known as the small craft facility. Here's where our YPs are kept. But they decided, hey, we can build this. And they sure enough did. Less than about 2 years later, they're dredging, and you can see the progress. This photograph is from 1940. Where you see the outline of today's current naval station, the concrete over there in the small craft facility. And by 1940, early 1941, the hangar is coming into place. The backfilling is getting there done. And over here, up in the upper top of the photograph, just for reference sake, you can see where the original location of the original hangar from 1911, from just 30 years before this photograph was taken. Of course, the towers are already in place now, but that shows you the progress in 30 years that was happening here at the Naval Academy. So by the time the United States got into World War II, by the time World War II started, the Naval Air Facility on the North Shore of the Severn was a fully functioning seaplane base. And it was used during the war as a transit point for VIPs traveling from Washington or from Philadelphia to Washington to Norfolk. It was basically a Navy transportation hub during the war. Which brings us to naval aviation in Annapolis during the war years, from 1939 to 1945. Okay, again, as we said, there were no midshipman flight operations during this period, only flights related to the war effort. So orientation flights were stopped at that point in time. But there was a lot of planning going on for naval air stations, including Annapolis. Remember, I said earlier, the Navy decided we needed airfields near all naval activities. Well, the Naval Academy is a naval activity. And so we started planning for it. And in 1943, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations recommended building an air station at Annapolis as soon as practicable, not to interfere, of course, with current war efforts. So we're going to look at this map again. And remember, the first location down here in 1911 was down here on Greenberry Point, and then the North Shore of the Severn. Now by 1943, these two, of course, are gone, and we have the naval base, the seaplane base that you see highlighted here in blue. Well, what the vice chief was looking for at that point in time was a real naval air station, not just a seaplane base. And that idea had actually been floated for a number of years earlier. They looked at several areas in South County and in other areas around Annapolis. But the one they started focusing on in 1943 was this chunk of land next to Sandy Point State Park, pretty much the whole north shore of the Broadneck Peninsula on the shore, bordering on the bay. And the plans they had for that was a massive air station, a massive airfield this would have been the footprint of it. And it would have extended pretty much from Sandy Point State Park to about the halfway mark of the half of the Cape St. Clair community today, bordered by what you see is Route 50 here. And this was going to be a significant field. They were going to have two 5,600-foot runways with plans for an additional future runway. This, of course, was before the Bay Bridge was in consideration, but it was just basically a sketch on paper at this point. What was in place, however, at this time, down here where you see highlighted in blue, was the state had just relocated, just built a new ferry terminal. They'd moved it from downtown Annapolis out here and you can still see remnants of it today as you go over the eastbound span of the Bay Bridge. That ferry terminal was built right here. And what the state wanted to do, we had Route 2 was the main north-south corridor to Baltimore. And the state's plan was to connect Route 2 with that ferry terminal by building a road like that, approximately that path. Now, if you're wondering why the road takes this really sort of northerly curlicue diversion, the reason for that at the time when the state was planning this road, all this land down here would have been far more expensive to acquire, to condemn. There's a lot more development as far as houses and whatnot in that area. So the state made their plan to most economically to get the land needed was to sort of take a diversion here and go north like that and come around and loop back to the new ferry terminal. So when the Navy came along with their plan to build this air station, the state was kind of between a rock and a hard place. It's like, okay, we've got the plans for this road and we're actually ready to start building. Navy, what are you going to do? Are you really going to build a field here? Well, the Navy, there's a lot of back and forth between the Navy, Department of the Navy, and the State Roads Commission. And finally, the state was, gave the Navy an ultimatum and said, look, we've got to start this construction. If you're going to build the field, tell us so, and we'll reroute the road. If you can't, or you're not, or you won't make a decision, we're going to build the road. And if later the Navy decides they're going to build this field, it'll be the Navy's responsibility to relocate that road now and get it out of the way. Well, the Navy didn't want to be faced with that. So the Secretary of the Navy announced to the State Roads Commission, Department of the Navy is going to build an air station on that site. So based on that, the Navy, or the state rather, rerouted the road and follows the road bed that we follow now when we're traveling out to go to the Bay Bridge. So apart from the Navy having thought about building this air station, today when you drive out to the Bay Bridge, you would normally be taking a slightly different route. And obviously that would have changed a lot of the landscape that we know today. So brings us to the post-war period in Annapolis, 1945 to 1961. This was a significant time as well. And in August of 1945, Vice Admiral Aubrey Fitch, class of 1906, which would have been a classmate of Lieutenant Towers, became the first naval aviator to be appointed superintendent. And in December 1945, he established the Department of Aviation, implementing 20 hours of flight time for every midshipman. Whether they were going to be pilots or not, he wanted to make sure every midshipman had a taste of airplanes and what they could do. His feeling was that they needed to be familiar with it. They needed to know the platform. They needed to know him as they would serve with him later in the fleet. Interesting thing with Vice Admiral Fitch was, as a young lieutenant, he actually took his first ride in an airplane from one of the old, they called them bamboo tails, like the Curtis. He flew with his classmate, Lieutenant Towers, and he was instantly enamored of aviation, which inspired him later. I'm not sure when he got his wings, but that inspired him to become an aviator. And then, of course, he made flag rank and he was appointed superintendent. And that was a major milestone for the Naval Academy, having the first aviator to be superintendent. And then in May 1946, USS Block Island was assigned to the Naval Academy for training and berthing, not as an active aircraft carrier. It wasn't like going out in the bay and planes weren't flying off and on it, but it was used for berthing the enlisted people that supported the station, as well as midshipmen that were over there for training. The midshipmen would come over, they would get training in the different areas of an aircraft carrier. You can see some planes that are staged here on the carrier deck. You see these little aircraft floated over here are the N3Ns. You're going to see a little more about them in just the next slide. And then the larger aircraft. So the NIDS would be brought over here to the naval station for their orientation flights. And there's a huge, a very involved routine that they went through. And again, they all got 20 hours during their career here. They all put at least 20 hours of flight time. The Block Island was here from 1946 until about 1951. And in July of 1947, that's when the N3N came on the scene. These were referred to as the Yellow Peril, not because they were particularly dangerous, but because they were a little bit of a challenge to fly and probably washed out more than a couple of would-be aviators, because the N3N was actually the Navy's primary aircraft, trainer aircraft. It was used like in Corpus Christi and in Pensacola. The airplane could be configured either and interchangeable either on floats or on wheels. It wasn't an amphibian, but within a matter of a few hours in the hangar, it could be converted from one to the other. And of course, in Annapolis, they were used in the float configuration, and you see it being lowered down the ramp here, and they were stored on these dollies, and they would just get lowered into the water and go on their flights. And the N3Ns here, you see them how they would be parked. They're on these dollies. These aircraft are all spun. They're all actually powered up and ready to go. They would literally taxi under the aircraft's power on these temporary wheels, these dollies, and then crew would turn them and guide them as they took them to the ramp. The N3Ns remained in service until the seaplane base itself was closed. And here's a photograph from probably the spring of 1951. You can see the nearly constructed Bay Bridge down here. You can see the old ferry terminal there. And these planes are coming back from a flight probably because they're heading back towards the seaplane base, which is over here. So 50 years. I always like to talk about 50 years. It's a nice round number. That's what we do today with the links in the chain at graduation. We always have the alumni from the 50 years earlier. A few of them pinning on the bars for the graduating ensigns. It's kind of a nice round number, and it indicates a significant passage. So Naval Aviation in Annapolis from 1911 to 1961 represented 50 years of progress. Let's look at it. In 50 years, Naval Aviation in Annapolis progressed from this picture to this. Now, you might look at that and say, that's 50 years of progress? Doesn't look like a lot of progress. I mean, think about it. You got, in both cases, you've got a biplane being helped into the water by several guys from the outside, 2 guys inside. What sort of progress is that? Well, let's look at the bigger picture, because the legacy of these early Annapolis aviators extended well beyond the shores of the Severn. Let's look at it. July 1st, 1911, the first naval aviator earned his wings. Barely a little less than 50 years later, 5 May 1961, we have Commander Alan Shepard, class of 1947. So you got on the left, you got class of 1905. On the right, you got the class of 1947. Became the first American in space. And that happened just 6 months before the Annapolis Naval Air Facility closed. So Naval Aviation in Annapolis in 1961, kind of the end of the road, because this is naval ships evolved from wood and fabric to steel and turbine engines. Naval aircraft evolved from wood and fabric to aluminum and turbine engines. Naval aviation had outgrown its first home. So on 5 January 1962, all Annapolis flight operations stopped. 12 days later, on 17 January 1962, the Naval Air Facility in Annapolis was formally decommissioned, bringing us to the end of an era and the end of what I hope hasn't been too long of a presentation. Now, at this point, during a live presentation, I normally entertain questions, and this is my favorite part. Well, this is recorded, but I still want your questions. Please note this email address, wingsonthesevern@gmail.com. Please send me your questions, your comments. If there's anything you think I got wrong here, any kind of questions, any thing that you think I can add to it, or whatever, I want to hear your comments. They're important to me, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Claude?
Ken, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation for this 175th anniversary of the United States Naval Academy. And for all of those of you listening, once the museum does reopen post-COVID, we will have our 175th anniversary of the Academy exhibit, actually 2 exhibits on both the first and second decks open. Until then, thanks a lot. We appreciate your support. Have a great day.